Imagine this, a conversation stretching over 1,000 years. Two faiths, sometimes in incredible intellectual harmony, other times facing really stark social divides.
Yeah, it's definitely not just a simple story of conflict. It's more like a tapestry, right? Tolerance, tension, change,
Yeah,
all woven together.
exactly. And today we're looking into Bernard Lewis and Mark R. Cohen's book, The Jews of Islam. It really digs into that whole intricate history.
Centuries of Jewish life under Muslim rule across huge areas. It's a massive topic.
It really is. Oh, and before we jump right in, just a quick mention of our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments.
Ah, yes.
We've got AI-powered analyses of significant books over there. It's all designed to get you thinking, reflecting on different subjects. Worth checking out.
Definitely. So this book, it introduces a really interesting idea, the Judeo-Islamic tradition.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, it suggests the shared civilization, religious and cultural, between Judaism and Islam, a real symbiosis, where they influenced each other back and forth.
More so, the book argues, than maybe the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Yeah, arguably, yes, in certain key ways. Early Islam, the book describes it as quite diverse, pluralistic even.
And their approach towards Jewish people was generally, well, not driven by strict theology.
Less ideological, perhaps, compared to how things often were in Christendom. It's interesting, some of the early Muslim critiques actually came from converts.
Converts from Christianity or even Judaism itself.
Exactly, which suggests those early interactions might have been more practical, less about rigid dogma at first.
But there were other trends within Islam too, right? More respectful ones?
Oh, absolutely. You see this particularly with Sufi mystics and certain rationalist thinkers. They often had a more understanding view of other faiths.
Okay, so let's talk about tolerance and intolerance. The book suggests Jewish communities, the dhimmis, they generally felt secure when Islamic rule was stable.
That seems to be the pattern, yes.
Yeah.
When the ruling power felt secure, the protected minorities, the dhimmis, generally experienced greater security as well.
But that wasn't always the case. Things shifted.
They did. External pressures made a big difference. Think about the Crusades or the Reconquista in Spain.
Challenges to Islamic power.
Right. And unfortunately, that often meant more insecurity for dhimmi communities in the affected areas. It wasn't uniform, though.
How so? Did it vary by region?
Significantly. The book points out that the dhimmi rules were sometimes enforced much more strictly on the edges of the Islamic world.
Like where, for example?
Well, consider the Almohads in the Islamic West, North Africa, and Spain. Their vision was quite purist.
And that had consequences.
Big ones. It basically marked the end of Christianity in North Africa, leaving Jews as the main religious minority. And they faced much harsher conditions under the Almohads.
You also mentioned Iran.
Yes, particularly after Shi'ism became the state religion, the doctrine of najasa, or ritual impurity, gained prominence.
Ritual impurity. How did that affect Jewish people?
It created more separation, more social restrictions, and sadly, a climate where Jewish people were seen by some as potentially defiling.
Understanding that context really changes how you read someone like Maimonides, doesn't it?
Absolutely. His famous comment about Islam being the most harmful nation to Israel. You have to remember, he lived through that intense Almohad persecution in Spain and Morocco.
So it wasn't necessarily a statement about all Muslim rule everywhere all the time.
Exactly. It reflected a specific, very harsh experience. We need to be careful not to overgeneralize from that.
Let's unpack the dhimmi system itself a bit more. Submission in exchange for protection, essentially.
That's the core idea. Pay the tribute, the jizya, accept Muslim dominance, and in return you get protection and retain your religion.
But the jizya tax wasn't just financial, was it? There was a symbolic element.
Often, yes. The way it was collected could sometimes involve rituals designed to emphasize the dhimmi's lower status. Humiliation, basically.
And there were other restrictions, legal, social.
Yes, the book lists several. Things like rules about clothing, not riding certain animals, not bearing arms, limits on building or repairing synagogues or churches.
And limitations in court, like their testimony might not hold the same weight.
Correct. Especially in cases involving Muslims. These disabilities clearly showed the inequality baked into the system.
But crucially, they generally had autonomy within their own communities.
That's a very important counterpoint. Yes, they usually ran their own internal affairs leadership, courts for disputes between themselves, religious practices. That internal autonomy was key.
And economically, were they shut out of most jobs? Forced into ghettos?
Generally, no. The book makes a point that widespread economic restrictions weren't typical. There were exceptions, of course, Morocco sometimes, Iran sometimes, and the early expulsion from Arabia, but usually they weren't barred from professions.
So it seems like there was this tension between religious rules and, well, just practical needs.
Definitely. There were rulings against getting too close to non-Muslims, taking them as confidants, that kind of thing.
But they still employed them.
Widely. Skills and usefulness often trumped religious guidelines. There's a great story about Caliph Umar Thurs. His governor, Abu Musa, had a Christian secretary. Umar questioned it, based on religious texts, but Abu Musa basically said, look, the administration needs his skills. It shows that pragmatism often won out.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Fast forward a bit. The book talks about the 19th century as the end of the tradition. Things deteriorated.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, yeah. Especially in places like Iran, Morocco, and even parts of the Ottoman Empire by then.
What kinds of things were happening?
One really disturbing development was the arrival of the blood libel.
That awful accusation about using blood for rituals? That came from Europe, didn't it?
Yes, imported from Christian anti-Semitism in Europe. It started appearing in the Middle East. This was also happening as Islamic power was weakening and European influence was growing.
So European powers started intervening more.
They did. Initially, often focused on protecting Christian minorities, but later Jewish communities too, sometimes through organizations like the French Alliance Israélite Universelle.
How did that intervention play out? Did it help?
It was complex. On one hand, it offered some protection. On the other, it sometimes increased resentment.
Resentment from Muslims.
Yes, because some non-Muslims were seen as benefiting from these Western connections, gaining influence as the traditional Islamic order weakened. It kind of drove a wedge between communities.
And you also had internal dynamics, like Eastern Christians adopting some of those anti-Semitic ideas.
Sadly, yes. Sometimes motivated by economic rivalry, they picked up on European anti-Semitic tropes. It all got very messy.
Though the book does note, the Ottoman reforms, ending the Dema system, offered some improvement compared to Iran.
Right. Iran seems to have been a particularly difficult place for Jews in the 19th century. The Ottoman changes, while complex, were arguably a relative positive step at that specific time.
The book really stresses judging tolerance in context, doesn't it? Avoid simplistic comparisons.
Absolutely. Comparing, say, Islamic theory to Christian practice, or the other way around, isn't really fair or intellectually honest. And tolerance is always easier when it's about something you don't care deeply about.
True. What about the intellectual back and forth? Did Judaism influence Islam?
Well, from the traditional Muslim perspective, the Quran is seen as the final perfect word. So the idea of borrowing from an earlier superseded religion like Judaism is problematic, even blasphemous to some.
But there are connections, stories, ideas.
There are things called Israeliyat. These are traditions, often stories about biblical figures that might have Jewish origins. They're used to flesh out Quranic narratives. Over time, the view of them shifted from neutral to sometimes quite negative, seen as potentially unreliable foreign influences.
Interesting. Are there specific examples of similarities, maybe even in practice?
The book mentions the timing of the Ramadan fast, for instance. The way dawn is defined might echo Talmudic definitions, though maybe with some deliberate changes to create distance.
And influence going the other way. Islam influencing Judaism.
Oh, hugely. Especially in philosophy and theology. Systematic Jewish theology really flowered in the Islamic world, often using the language and concepts of Muslim scholasticism, the kalam.
So the vocabulary itself was influenced.
Definitely. Arabic had a massive impact on Hebrew, particularly for philosophical and scientific terms. Think of Maimonides writing the Guide for the Perplexed initially in Arabic.
Wow. Did it extend beyond philosophy to worship arts?
Yes. The book notes potential Muslim influences on some synagogue rituals and practices, and in literature. A massive, mostly one-way influence. Hebrew poetry in the Islamic Golden Age adopted Arabic meters, styles, themes.
A real transformation.
And even in visual arts, there were shared attitudes, particularly regarding the reluctance to depict human or animal figures.
What about daily life? Jobs, conversion?
Since roles in the military and top levels of government were often restricted, Jews frequently specialized in fields like medicine and finance. They became quite prominent there.
And conversion to Islam, why did that happen?
All sorts of reasons. Genuine faith, certainly. But also escaping the hardships or disabilities of dhimmi status, personal ambition, social pressure, and sometimes, though less commonly, forced conversion.
The book mentions some prominent converts.
Yes. Figures like Ka'b al-Bar, a scholar from Yemen, Yaqub ibn Kilis, who became a vizier in Egypt, Rashid al-Din Fatlala, a major statesman and historian in Persia. It shows converts could reach very high positions.
Let's look at the Ottoman Empire again. It seems like a relatively better period for Jewish communities, especially after 1492.
Generally, yes. The arrival of Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal was a huge event. They revitalized existing communities.
Brought new energy, new skills.
Exactly. Knowledge of Europe, languages, trade connections. They eventually became the dominant Jewish group in many Ottoman lands, culturally overshadowing the older Romaniot communities. Ottoman surveys actually give us pretty good demographic data from that time.
And they contributed a lot economically.
Significantly. There's that famous letter from Isaac Zarfati urging European Jews to come to Ottoman Turkey, saying it was far better than facing persecution in Christian lands.
But even there, things declined later in the 19th century.
Yes, those later European travelers' accounts often describe poverty and difficult conditions. It reflects changes in the Ottoman Empire itself, but also maybe changing European expectation of what was acceptable. Losing some of those European connections didn't help either.
And Morocco and Iran remained more challenging.
It seems so. Morocco had that Almohad legacy, and Jews were the only significant non-Muslim group, leading to stricter rules and sometimes ritualized humiliation. Iran had the Najasa issue, periods of forced conversion, and reports from the 19th century describe a lot of fear and degradation.
Then there was the Damascus affair in 1840. That seems like a real flashpoint.
A pivotal moment, absolutely. The blood libel rearing its head again, instigated by a French consul of all people.
But it also showed growing European involvement.
Yes, the British intervened quite forcefully on behalf of the accused Jews. It really highlighted the shifting power dynamics and emerging international humanitarian concerns, however imperfectly applied.
And the Alliances Relate Universal you mentioned earlier. Their role grew after things like this.
It did. They set up schools, provided aid, basically Western Jews organizing to help their brethren in the East. Their reports are actually a valuable source for understanding conditions at the time.
So tracing this history leads us towards the rise of modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world.
The book argues that's a distinct phenomenon, though it draws on some older threads. The conflict over Palestine and the creation of Israel became a major catalyst.
And it involved adopting European anti-Semitic ideas.
Yes, unfortunately. Myths like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, Nazi propaganda, European-style caricatures, they started appearing widely in Arab media.
A shift from the traditional, often ambivalent or discriminatory, but not necessarily racialized view.
Exactly. A transformation towards a modern, political, and often racialized form of anti-Semitism. It's a grim evolution.
It's clear this history is incredibly complex. Periods of real cultural flourishing and exchange, but also undeniable hardship and discrimination. Not a simple picture at all.
Definitely not. Understanding that nuance, the shifts over time and place, is just crucial if we want to move beyond simplistic slogans or generalizations.
Well said. And for more explorations like this, remember you can check out our other conversations and also the Mindful Moments YouTube channel for those visual book analyses.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How does understanding these long historical patterns of how faiths interacted, the good and the bad, help us think about challenges around diversity and inclusion today?
That's a great question to leave people with. Definitely subscribe to our channel for more discussions that get you thinking. Share this one if you found it valuable.
And you can support our work by grabbing the book through the link in the description.
Most importantly, keep engaging with these complex histories critically. Think for yourself, form your own informed views. Thanks for joining us.